This is a very dramatic passage that we are engaging today. It is a passage that is full of dramatic visions. You can see what is happening as you listen to Ezekiel relate what his experience was. We see as he is dropped into a valley. And we have learned in the past that unlike, we talk a lot about peaceful valleys, right? But during ancient biblical times, the valley was not the safest place to be. Which is why when we speak of God, they always speak of God being on the mountain. Valleys were low places. Valleys were dangerous places where danger hid. Valleys were not hopeful or safe places to be. It was something that you passed through to get to the next elevation. So in this instance, Ezekiel is picked up by God and in the spirit is dropped down into a valley that is filled with human bones. Filled with human bones. Now, I was thinking the other day, I watch a lot of crime shows, and there will be instances where they'll be excavating a building. They're tearing down a building to put a new building up or something. And anyway, in that process of digging and uncovering, they come across human bones. And what happens? Everything stops, right? Because we're not supposed to encounter human bones in our day-to-day doings. And so Ezekiel says that this valley is full of human bones. The bones of a destroyed people. And particularly with ancient Israel, where your bones found their final rest was important. Even if someone was initially buried elsewhere or entombed elsewhere, there was a point at which the bones of that person were then gathered and taken to the ancestral crypt or burial place. There was this sense in which the bones of kindred were meant to reside together. And we have this valley, and these people aren't residing anywhere. They are scattered and strewn about. A valley of bones of the unknown and the unburied. This is where Ezekiel found himself. The bones of a people who were conquered by the Babylonians, and everything came crashing down on them. At this point, when Ezekiel has this experience, the land of Judah has been pretty much wiped out. There is no more temple. And the temple symbolized that God dwelt among them. Where is God? There's no more divinely anointed king because they were a conquered people. There was no more nation to speak of. These people had been driven off in exile as prisoners of war, or they still dwelt in their homeland, but it was a sad and tragic homeland filled with rubble and grief. This is a powerful text. We feel it down to our bones, don't we? But like most famous texts, particularly biblical texts, it can be interpreted in a number of different ways, sometimes for the good, and sometimes, sadly, for the not so good. So we will begin today with a few moments speaking of the caution of this text, and then move on to the encouragement of the text. The caution of this text is that it can be read and understood as a nationalistic text. It speaks a lot about being returned to the land. It speaks about soil that has been given to you. It speaks a lot about, again, of bone and flesh and soil. It talks of Israel being restored to her former glory. I will give you your own soil. And all of the talk of bone and flesh can actually be drawn as a dangerous parallel to the phrase blood and soil, which is the cry of Christian nationalists and fascists throughout history. The belief that says, God gave us this land to conquer, it is ours. It doesn't belong to outsiders. It doesn't belong to immigrants. It doesn't belong to adherents of other faith. There are some Christians in the United States that believe that the United States is the new Israel, the new nation that is supremely blessed by God above all others. There are those who believe that we are meant to be a distinctly Christian nation in the specific narrow way that they understand what it means to be a Christian. So there is a caution in this text, because I am reasonably certain that where I'm preaching from one perspective, there will be others who will be preaching this text and saying this is the United States and we must reclaim our former glory and we must turn ourselves from our sin and go back to the good old days. But we know, don't we, that our nation is not a theocracy. We live in a region of great diversity where our next door neighbor may be a Muslim or a Buddhist or nothing at all. And that is okay. This text does not apply to the United States as a nation, because we are not a defeated nation. We are not like Judah was in that moment. If anything, it's just one of the realities, we've always been the conquerors, haven't we? And we must be sensitive to that when we read these kinds of texts. We are not Israel. We are Babylon. We are the great and powerful empire that has done much good, but that has also done much harm. And so if any community can relate to the despair of this story, it would probably be the Native American indigenous population, wouldn't it? Theirs was the culture that was destroyed. Theirs were the people that were hauled off into exile, most of them on reservations, driven out into the far west or the Midwest when perhaps they had formerly lived along the Atlantic coast, being driven into foreign and alien lands. Their sacred sites and their beliefs were desecrated. Theirs were the body that lay strewn on the battlefield after Wounded Knee and any number of different battles that were fought. So we mustn't play the nationalistic victim when we read this text. And so from the perspective of a culture or a people, let us be aware of that and read with sensitivity. That is the caution. But there is also encouragement in this text if we look at it from more of a personal perspective. Picture this, if you will. The musical artist Prince started one of his songs. He says, "Dig, if you will, a picture. Dig, if you will, this picture. A valley full of the calcified remnants of a once living and thriving people. Human skulls of every size strewn about in the dust, leached and desiccated as the weathered buffalo skulls in a Georgia O'Keeffe painting. It is arid, it is dry, it is parched, it is lifeless." And the text says that God dropped Ezekiel into the middle of that hellish landscape. Didn't give him a bird's eye view. It says he dropped him down into the middle of it. And then it says that God led Ezekiel all around it. So there's a sense in which you were not called to be above the suffering of others, even if they are your people or otherwise. Sometimes God calls us to get into the middle of it so we can really feel the loss, the despair, the toll that has been enacted upon a people. God wanted Ezekiel to take in the full extent of the devastation, and I am sure that was not an easy sight. Bones, everywhere bones, skeletons disconnected from one another, skulls scattered about. Most of us have probably seen the videos within the last 2 days of the towns in Mississippi that suffered massive tornado damage. Have you seen that? It was shocking, wasn't it? Out of nowhere, this thing touched down, and nothing in the tornado's path was left standing. If you watch the video, there is just acre after acre of unidentifiable piles of rubble. Some of those piles even had cars perched atop them that had been picked up by the power of the wind and set down in unlikely places. And just a month ago, wasn't it? We watched the people in Syria and Turkey reeling from the impact of devastating earthquakes. A lost people, many dead people among the rubble. Devastation and suffering are and have always been very real. And another reality is it doesn't take the world too long to turn its attention elsewhere, because there's always some other catastrophe that comes along that, as I'd say, pushes it from the top of the newspaper fold down to the bottom. If you have suffered the death of a close loved one, you know that at first, even in all of your pain, you receive lots of support, don't you? Friends and neighbors check in with phone calls, cards, and casseroles. If you need anything, just call me, we tell people. But as time goes by, the outward shows of support wane, even though your grief remains for weeks, for months, and perhaps even for years. And sometimes it feels like it is just you and God walking in the desert of the dead. Dry bones. Dry bones. But thanks be to God that for most of us, our journey will eventually lead us back onto the path of life. And thank God there are still people in our world who will remain sensitive to us as we journey through that process of grief, so that we are not utterly forgotten. So the message for our souls today is just another reminder that God's love has the power to revive and restore, even when it seems unlikely. Even when you have felt dead and discarded for so long that the possibility of renewed life seems almost ludicrous, because you can't even imagine the sunshine anymore, much less see it. And folks around us, of course, they think that we are alive. I mean, we comb our hair and we brush our teeth and we spruce up to look presentable. In other words, like the story of Ezekiel, our flesh and bones are present. They go through the paces. But inside, we can still feel like lifeless, walking dead. I've wanted to do some sort of a exploration of what the proliferation of zombie films and television shows and everything say about the state of our culture at this moment? Are we wrestling with this concept of what does it mean to be living but not fully alive? But the power of God's Spirit, this text tells us, the Ruah, I love that word. It means breath. It means breath of God. Ruah, doesn't it? The Ruah, the breath of God, can make even the deadest soul come alive. But like Ezekiel, we've got to speak that power over and into ourselves, individually and as a community. How can the dead be restored to life? Well, Ezekiel shows us that in the midst of despair, evidently the first step is a dialogue with God. God plops Ezekiel down into the middle of a hopeless place. What's your hopeless place right now? What's your hopeless place? What is your rubble that you were trying to sift through? What's in your valley that refuses to speak life? For some of us here, it is literally our bones. I've got aching knee bones. We've got grating hip bones in the room, don't we? We've got broken ribs and collarbones. We've got the rubble of crumbling vertebrae. Sometimes, particularly as we age, our bones can become a valley in which we remain trapped. And sometimes our physical pain can drown out the still small voice of faith. It's just a part of being human, isn't it? So now, remember in this moment that you are more than your bones, that you are more than your flesh, that the Spirit of the living God dwells in you. Some of us, it's our bones, it's our physical body, or it's our employment situation. For others of us, it is our religion that is lying in rubble. Because the security and certainty of past biblical literalism has died, and you know you can't go home again. And you find yourself in a spiritual wilderness, sitting in the wilderness among the rubble of your crumbled faith, wondering if any of it was real. Oh, those bones, those dry bones, oh God. And God asks us the question. Before he asks us the question. He says, mortal, that's you. Can these bones live? And so when we look at our theme for Lent, which is seeking questions for deeper faith, that's the first question for deeper faith this morning that God asks of us. Can these bones live? And notice that Ezekiel doesn't answer that question by saying, why, yes, God, of course they can. Because perhaps he didn't believe it either. The only thing Ezekiel says in response to the question is, Lord, you know. You know. I don't know. I'm not sure, but you know. Oh Lord, as the old spiritual says, my trouble's so hard, don't nobody know my troubles but God. Nobody knows, Lord, but you know. Nobody knows whether these bones can be brought back to life. But God, you asked the question, and so you know. And so that conversation becomes an invitation to participation. Ezekiel's conversation with God becomes an invitation invitation to participation. Because when Ezekiel replies and says, Lord, you know, you're bigger than all of this. Lord, you know. Then God says to Ezekiel, Zeke, you have to speak over those bones. You have to speak over the bones. You must use the breath that I have given you to speak to the dead bones. And initially it will be terrifying, because once you speak over them, bones will start flying everywhere. As the thigh bone looks for the right shin bone, which looks for the right arm bone. Bones are flying around, but don't let the noise and the clatter deter you when the whirlwind starts, because that is God at work. You just keep speaking the words of life as you walk by faith. One of my favorite gospel choir songs is one that's called Encourage Yourself. And it says, sometimes you have to encourage yourself. Sometimes you have to speak victory during the test. No matter how you feel, speak the word and you will be healed. So speak over yourself. Encourage yourself in the Lord. And then it goes on to say, as I minister to you, I minister to myself. Life can hurt you so till it seems there's nothing left. But no matter how you feel, speak the word and you will be healed. Speak over yourself. Encourage yourself in the Lord. This morning I declare to you that the healing will come. It will not be instantaneous, but you are loved by God. You are held by God. And our faith and the faith in our resurrected Christ tells us that God's aim for us is always wholeness and unity. So this morning, no matter how tired or despairing you may feel, I challenge you and I exhort you, speak words of life over your situation. Be audacious. If it's embarrassing, do it in the privacy of your own home. I do most of mine in my car. I pull up to my house, I turn my car off, and sometimes I sit in my driveway in front of my house for 20 minutes. And that's when actually God and I do some serious talking. Don't know why. Some people have a prayer closet. I have a prayer car. Speak over your situation. Speak words of life even over others that you know are living in the valley and the shadow of death, as Psalm 23 says. So the first question is, can these bones live? And that first answer is, Lord, you know. I give it to you. The second question I would ask us is this. And here's the challenging part. Have you been faithful to respond like Ezekiel in your particular situation? Do you dare to believe that you are an important part of the process of God's restoring things to life? Have you spoken life this past week to someone, to somebody, to some situation, in word or in deed? Are you speaking life as God has commanded us to prophesy? Or have we become so fixed on ourselves and our own real, valid struggles that we've stopped praying for other people? Especially when a condition goes on and it is unrelenting and there's no end in sight. It can wear us down to the point that we forget that we are meant to be agents of God's love and grace in this world. And that starts with prayer. If you can't do anything else, flat on your back, you can pray. You can send a text to somebody to say, I was thinking of you. How are you doing? Friends, let's change that today. If Lent is meant to be a time of introspection and reflection as we seek to repent and to do better, while not also living under condemnation, let's change that today. If you've fallen off your beat a little bit and you haven't been praying for anybody, or you haven't been speaking a word of encouragement to anybody, let's just commit today that when we leave here today, we're going to do a little bit better. I listened to a YouTube program, podcast of these. I think I've mentioned it to you. It's two young people, young married people, and they listen to old school music. And so I love it because the music that they're listening to is always from my heyday. So there's just this great joy of having someone younger behind you hear what you used to listen to and to find joy in it and to get excited about it. But the thing that I've realized about this station or channel is that they call the people who subscribe to their YouTube channel, they call it the Rob Squad family, right? And one of the things that they say at the end of every one is it's like, there's only one thing that you have to do. And then he'll say to his wife, what is that, honey? And she says, you've just got to make somebody smile. Such a throwaway little line. But what if that was our intention, to say every day the minimal that I can do is just to make somebody smile, and to believe that it is a work of God to do that. So friends, speak life while you are yet in the valley. And as we close today, for those of us who are gathered in this sanctuary, as we go into our time of meditation and prayer, I invite you to remember someone who's really going through it right now, and just to speak over them, to speak the power of God into their lives, to speak encouragement over that situation. You don't have to do it aloud. Nobody even has to know who you're praying for or what you're praying about. But let us today use this time for us to intentionally speak encouragement over the people in this church and those that are in our lives. Can we do that? And as we speak that encouragement, know this, friends. God promises restoration. God promises resuscitation. God promises resurrection. And every aspect of our faith speaks to that. So let us walk into it, even as we walk toward the cross, because we know that just as the valley of dry bones was not the end, Jesus hanging on the cross was not the end. That bag of bones that was laid in the tomb on that Friday evening was not the end. Because by the power of God, we know that God can breathe life into that which is dead. And for that, we are grateful. Amen. And so let us now go into our time of meditation and use that time to pray for somebody else, believing that as you do that, somebody else is praying for you.